Mr. Norman, welcome to the special podcast.
Thank you.
Did you ever meet John Lennon?
Yes, I did. I met him when I was a young journalist, and the Beatles were making their last UK tour at the end of 1965. I was thrown out of their dressing room in Newcastle-on-Tyne in Britain.
You were thrown out of their dressing room?
Yeah, by Neil Aspinall, who was the road manager. And what you'd do, you'd be there and you'd think the Beatles were your best friends, and you'd say, could I stay and talk to you for longer? They'd, oh, yeah, sure. And then this guy would come in and say, get out. And I'd say, well, they said I could stay. And he said, well, I say you've got to go, go.
So you went?
So I went.
Yeah. And that was the only time you met Lennon?
No. I talked to him then, and McCartney and Ringo. The only one I didn't was George. He looked a bit sulky, I recall. Then later on, in 1969, I was working for the Sunday Times in London, and I spent several weeks around the Apple house, their business that they had called Apple. And one of the days I was there, I spent just sitting in John and Yoko's office, watching them talk to other people. So I spent a long time with John and Yoko on that day, watching them just be John and Yoko. And then I saw John also around the building, and that was when really the Beatles were breaking up. And what was so amazing was that he was so nice, he was so polite, and he had time to stop and talk to me. And even back in the first time I met him, he was under a lot of pressure then in 1965, and they didn't want to be with the Beatles anymore, hated touring, hated the screams and all that.
Did he tell you that?
He didn't tell me, no. I had no idea at the time, because he seemed so nice, and he wasn't being horrible and violent and taking it out on a local journalist he might have done, He was just nice and listened to you and sort of was interested in you, and that was John. Everybody who met him really sort of fell under his spell.
Did you have a special interest in him especially, or were you also interested in Paul McCartney and George Harrison and Ringo Starr?
If you were a young man or a young person in Britain in the 60s, you were just interested in the Beatles because it was a kind of source of national pride. They had to do well. You wanted them to do well. When they went off to America, you hoped and prayed they would do well. No other pop group from Britain had really done well in America before. So it was like a sort of collective pride that you felt, and excitement as well, because everything they did was new. Every time they made a new record, it sounded different. We were used to records that sounded all the same. Every record sounded the same from other artists. Yeah. The Beatles always went back to square one and were different. So it was just exciting. Life was exciting because of the Beatles.
Your Lennon biography reached the world news because of your claim that Lennon had sexual fantasies about his mother. That's quite a bold statement. Where did you find that information?
John, you have to understand the situation with his mother. His mother had given him away to his aunt to bring up and look after. But his mother was still very much around in his childhood, and his mother was very beautiful. But to John, she was more like an older sister, flirtatious older sister. And because he was John and nothing was unthinkable to John, as he got older into his teens, his mother was living with another man and had 2 children with another man, but never married this man. And there was a sort of sexual atmosphere in the house that they lived in, and John was aware of this. And to the end of his life, he kept on talking about the fact that she was so beautiful. He said, this is John, John would say an outrageous thing like this. He said he always regretted that he didn't have sex with her. He told this for the first time to a journalist called Maureen Cleave.
Maureen Cleave,
who was the journalist who he actually told the thing about the Beatles being bigger than Christ, bigger than Jesus. This is a much more amazing thing to tell that journalist. Of course, you could never print it. You could hardly print it today. But it was something that just returned to his mind a lot, because he was so fixated on his childhood, and right to the end of his life he was. And he told Yoko Ono, his second wife, he told her about it, but he kept on talking about it. It was a sort of obsession, because he felt that his mother never really belonged to him, even though she was around throughout his childhood until her tragic death. And she became a sort of fantasy figure. Now, this is, let's not, we are living in the 21st century, and psychiatry teaches us that a lot of people do have sexual feelings towards their...
You don't say it, you don't say it openly.
You don't say it, and certainly there's a time, in an early childhood, boy's early childhood, where his mother is a sort of sort of figure that is everything, including a kind of, a sexual object, possibly, as well as everything else.
Yeah. But for a good understanding, Yoko Ono has told you about it, or did you hear it from Maureen?
She told me about it. Then Maureen Cleave said, "Oh yes, he told me that." Quite matter-of-factly. And then John made a tape as well where he talked about his mother would have a rest in the afternoon and he'd be around, and he was next to her one afternoon and he kind of thought that it might have happened. But I don't think for one second his mother encouraged him in that thought. I just think it was something that went on in John's mind.
Not only did John Lennon have sexual fantasies about his mother, he also would have sexual feelings about Paul McCartney. Who told you that?
No, I don't think he had sexual feelings about Paul McCartney.
You don't think so?
No, that was, that was just the tabloids in Britain saying that for a cheap headline. John wanted to be a real artist, and he thought a real artist should try everything. He called it a bohemian, should be open to all kinds of experience. Possibly to homosexuality. He was not homosexual at all. He was rampantly heterosexual.
He was not bisexual.
Not bisexual, no. He liked campness a bit sometimes. And he was totally aware of the sort of vulnerability of homosexual men in England at that time, because homosexuality was against the law. He didn't have any sexual feelings for Paul McCartney. It crossed his mind that he perhaps ought to try homosexuality, to be a real artist. And Paul was around, but there was no question of Paul ever sort of being involved in such a thing. So
Paul McCartney has said, "I don't think the gay claims are true. John never ever tried anything. I slept with him 1,000,000 times."
Exactly. They would travel together. They would share body heat. They were so cold in these vans they travelled around in. They would get close together just to get some heat, and there was no sexual frisson at all. They would sleep in the same room. The Beatles would be in one little hotel room, or in Hamburg, There was never any question of that, but it was just something that was on John's mind, that maybe he should be open to all kinds of experience.
Yeah, because there also has been speculation about John's